everyone, and welcome into crushthestreet.com. I am Kenneth Amaduri, and we're going to be discussing something here at Crush the Street as it pertains to geopolitics, something we don't discuss very much here. We have touched on it somewhat in the past, but it's geopolitics in the Middle East. And we have Eva Barlett on the line, who's an independent writer and rights activist with extensive experience in Syria and the Gaza Strip, where she lived a number of years. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. And I have a feeling we're going to get some information today that we don't normally hear in the mainstream media. So it's going to be an exciting discussion. Her website is ingaza.wordpress.com. Eva, thanks for coming on Crush the Street with me today.
You're welcome, and I want to apologize for having delayed so much. I know you wanted to talk with me when I was in Syria, but that wasn't possible eventually, so thank you for your patience.
It's no problem. Better late than never. And again, we're excited to have you on the show. If you would, give us your background, how you ended up living in the Middle East, and I guess an important summary, in your opinion, on what is going on there, if you can summarize it in a minute or two here, on what has taken place, and what is the mainstream narrative, and what do people need to understand about what is really going on in Syria and the Gaza Strip and in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'll try to keep my background very brief. I grew up very apolitical in a musical family. I studied music. I didn't study politics or journalism. And in my late 20s, I woke up to the issue of Palestine, which I'd never heard of before in my life, and started researching quite a bit and decided I had to go and see for myself, which I eventually did in 2007, spending 8 months in the occupied West Bank, in some of the areas where Palestinians suffer the most at the hands of the Israeli army or the illegal occupiers, the Jewish colonists. And I saw quite a bit in those 8 months, and eventually was arrested a few times and deported by the Israeli authorities and basically forbidden from returning to Palestine. However, I was able to go to Gaza the following year by boat, sailing with the original boat movement, the Free Gaza campaign, to the Gaza Strip. I went in November 2008 and stayed there a cumulative 3 years. And so that included being there during two horrific massacres of the population in 2008-9 and also in 2012. And aside from that, documenting to my best ability the daily crimes against Palestinian civilians by Israeli authorities, including the full blockade on Gaza, which has restricted, hugely restricted entry of items into Gaza, almost totally prohibited any sort of exports, has decimated the population, rendered them impoverished. And on top of that, those who try to work in the sea or in the border regions are assaulted with live ammunition on a daily basis. So basically, that's what I was focusing on in Gaza. However, when things began in Syria in early 2011, I was paying attention. I didn't leave Gaza finally until March 2013, so I wasn't able to go to Syria until the following year. However, I was keenly paying attention and had the sense that, like with Libya, what we were hearing in the corporate media was not entirely correct, or perhaps a great distortion. And after I finally did go to Syria, and I just come back from my 9th visit there, which this time it was for 1 month. Previous visits have been for 1 month, 2 months, a week, depending. All that to say that from my travels throughout Syria, largely on my own, by the way, and speaking conversational Arabic with the people I'm meeting, I've come to conclude, like other people who've gone to Syria, researched deeply, that what the corporate media has said about Syria being a popular uprising from 2011 against the government, against the president, wanting to overthrow the president, is complete nonsense and complete fabrications. And the corporate media and Gulf media, particularly, for example, Al Jazeera, but also supposedly independent media, for example, Democracy Now!, have all been guilty of war propaganda against the Syrian people.
That is powerful, especially as it pertains to people's lives and livelihoods. So what is the opposing sides? What's the conventional thinking is, if you could describe that for us, and why do you disagree with it?
Okay, so I would note that there is internal opposition within Syria, and there have been opposing political parties within Syria prior to 2011, but then they became fully legitimized after 2011. So you have an array of different political stances in Syria. And I've met with internal opposition there. And for the moment, they're saying, look, our focus is to end the international terrorism in our country. And then we go back to our political ideologies and what we want to see changed in the government. And the government has made a lot of changes since 2011. However, the opposition presented by Western nations consists largely of spokespersons with a Muslim Brotherhood background or some other extremist background like Salafi or Wahhabi, the extreme ideology emanating from Saudi Arabia. And so we're meant to believe that these people are going to bring freedom and change to Syria. And Syria, I'm sure your viewers are aware of, is a secular, pluralistic country where all faiths are enjoyed and there's no repression against faiths. And were the so-called opposition that the Western nations present to us in power in Syria, this would be a dramatic change. You would not have the freedoms, the liberties that you currently have in Syria. And I'd just like people to imagine in our own countries, wherever you happen to be living, would you really want to be ruled by some group like Jaish al-Islam, al-Nusra, or what they call the moderates, who are always, in the end, either affiliated to or working with al-Qaida and these extremists? Would you want to live under the rule of these characters? They are far, far worse than whatever demonizations you've heard of the Syrian government. So this is the opposition that we're told is going to liberate Syria. Now, every time the Syrian army liberates an area like Aleppo in 2016 or Ghouta some months ago in April and May 2018, or other areas like Homs, which was at one point called the capital of the revolution, or more recently Dara, which was called the birthplace of the revolution. Every time these areas are liberated, life returns and peace and stability returns. However, I've been to all these areas, and I actually recently wrote an op-ed for RT saying, look, when Nikki Haley, although she's no longer with us in the political realm, and Western leadership are crying for civilians in Idlib, they're negating the presence of at least 70,000 to 100,000 terrorists in Idlib. And they're also negating the history that in every instance when the Syrian army and allies have liberated areas formerly occupied by what we are told are rebels or opposition, in every instance, schools are no longer used as headquarters for terrorists. Schools return to being schools where children of both sexes can study together their curriculum instead of studying the warped ideology presented by terrorists. And hospitals are no longer used as headquarters by terrorists, as was the case in eastern Aleppo. So basically, it's a huge and shameful, what's the word? I mean, there's got to be a better word than lie. It's an immense amount of propaganda that we've been told from day one about what's happening in Syria and what's best for the Syrian people. But if you just go to Syria, forget me, forget any so-called expert, which I don't claim to be, by the way, go to Syria and talk with the Syrian people, and I swear you will only meet a handful, if that, of people who do not support their president, who do not support their army, and who do not want Syria to return to exactly how it was prior to 2011.
Well, that's very telling, especially boots on the ground experience like you've had, speaking with people directly in their language. So how does this pertain to the US dollar specifically? And do you believe that there's any tie to that as to why we are seeing such a huge propaganda force towards misinformation?
So finance is not my area of expertise, so I'll have to stab an opinion at this, hazard an opinion. We do know that this isn't just about imposing puppet governments in Syria. It's also about control of oil and resources in that area. And it's also about the currency wars. And I'm not going to say too much because I'll reveal my ignorance on currency. But I mean, you do see that the allies that have stepped up to Syria are certainly not allies of America and of the Western, of the NATO alliance. These allies are Russia, China, and other nations, Iran, all nations that have either been targeted by the West or will soon be targeted by the West. So I do think that the dollar does have something to do with it, but it's a multi-layered question why the West wants to topple Syria, and it's by no means a new desire. They've been scheming against Syria for decades, and the Muslim Brotherhood has played a role in these schemes for decades. But certainly, yes, in the greater scheme of things, Syria's support to Palestinian resistance and to Hezbollah, their alliance, and support to Hezbollah, political support at least, the support for the liberation of Palestine, the refusal of the demand that the occupied Syrian Golan that Israel currently occupies be returned to them, and the refusal to allow in, I believe it's the World Bank and international institutions that inevitably destroy countries. Syria refused to allow those into its country. So those are all factors in why the West is so desperate to occupy Syria.
Eva, would you give us an example, in your opinion, what's the most blatant example of misinformation that you would say happened? You know, is it the toppling of Assad, you know, the chemical attacks, or any other example that, you know, if you were to leave us and say, you know, look into this, if you know, forget everything else I said, but look into this, and this will really open your eyes.
Well, there are many examples. I'll try to keep these brief. Before Aleppo was liberated in December 2016, the media was in chorus saying that the Russians and Syrians are slaughtering civilians in Aleppo, and they inflated the number to 300,000 civilians in Aleppo. When eastern Aleppo was actually liberated, it turned out the number of civilians there was less than half that, and they had wanted to leave, but they could not because they were being prevented from leaving by terrorist factions, including al-Qaida, and they were being starved by these same terrorist factions. And even Reuters reported on the fact that civilians said terrorists were hoarding food and starving them. The same scenario played out in Homs, which I went to in 2014. It played out in Ghouta, which I went to some months ago, and it played out in Madaya. And Madaya was another example. If you just Google Madaya is hungry, Madaya is starving, you will see that corporate media, again, had this concentrated campaign demonizing Syria and Russia for starving the people of Madaya. When I went in June 2017, the civilians there told me no. In fact, they kept sending food aid in, but terrorists kept keeping the food aid for themselves. So the issue of starvation and the Syrian government targeting civilians is one that has been used over and over again, as has the issue of chemical weapons. I went to Douma some months ago after these latest claims that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons there. The nurse in the medical clinic there told me that there was no indication whatsoever that any of the patients they were treating had been exposed to any sort of chemical. They were treated for shock and asphyxiation and sent home. And all the civilians I spoke with preferred to talk about the hellish rule of life under Jaish al-Islam, which was ruling that area. So the chemical weapons story has been used over and over again. And it's notable this past time when the West insisted that Syria had used chemical weapons before any inspectors had entered the country. In fact, a day or two before, France, the US, and the UK bombed Syria with over 100 missiles, including targeting an area of Damascus called Berzeh. And in that area, there was a complex that was producing treatment for cancer, medication for cancer treatment, and other things. And this was completely destroyed because the West said this is potentially a chemical weapons manufacturing site or something to that effect. So the chemical story has been used over and over again. And of course, the story of the valiant rescuers known as the White Helmets, who bizarrely, these wondrous volunteers they only specifically operate in areas controlled by al-Qaida and other extremists. But we are told that they've saved over 110,000, 115,000 lives. And here I'd really encourage people to look up the work of Vanessa Beeley, who's dug very deeply into the White Helmets, this propaganda construct, hugely funded by Western nations and complicit in crimes with terrorists. And yet we are told that these are people that are rescuing civilians from Syrian and Russian bombings.
So my next question is, have you noticed a significant material difference between, you know, the Obama administration and, you know, who had Hillary Clinton heavily involved with what was going on in the Middle East? And has it been different with President Trump in the White House in this administration?
I'm not really good at What I can say is that the overall policy of attempting to enforce regime change continues in Syria. I've heard the argument that President Trump is killing off the deep state, is doing certain things to appease certain warmongers within the state. I'm not 100% sure I believe that. In fact, I'm not prone to surmising because I can't at the end of the day know what his true intentions are. All I can say is that the US presence in Syria is illegal. It's contrary to international law. And the US, whether under Trump or his predecessors, have not been fighting ISIS, have not honestly been fighting ISIS. They've done everything to allow ISIS to flourish. And the only people who have been fighting ISIS, which we are told is the US's great concern, the only people that are fighting ISIS are the Syrian Arab Army, the Russian forces, and their regional allies. So, in terms of what his long-term goals are, I can't say, but their presence in Syria and their backing of Kurdish militias is all illegal.
Eva, so what has you optimistic, or does anything have you optimistic in the region of things going in a more positive direction as you would see it?
Well, for Syria, what gives me optimism is the people themselves, because you have to look at it. They've been facing for over 7 years now some of the worst criminals, these terrorists that have been slaughtering in the most despicable, horrific ways, beheading, point-blank assassinations, and horrific things they've been doing to Syrian civilians. But the people have been facing it and been supporting the army, because in the end, the Syrian army is made up of the Syrian people, and supporting their country. And they've stood, I think it's truly remarkable that they've been able to stand against not only the terrorists, but the forces that are backing them, the NATO alliance, the Gulf alliance, and Israel and Turkey. And it's something like over 80%, maybe 90% of Syrian areas that were occupied have been liberated, except, of course, Idlib and the areas I mentioned where the US is occupying in Kurdish forces. So I think that people should really step back and look at how the Syrian people have been able to largely defeat terrorism while maintaining their country as intact as possible while under criminal sanctions. And the other thing that gives me some optimism is that as I mentioned before, in all these areas that have been liberated, you have life returning. So when I was in Syria this time, I went to an ancient Christian village named Ma'lula, and that village still celebrates a nearly 1,700-year-old celebration, the Festival of the Cross. And it's the only, or one of the only villages on earth that still celebrates this. And the only time it was, this celebration, September 13th, was paused was when terrorists occupied that village. So it was profoundly moving to be there during the Mass and then the actual celebration, because you saw these ancient traditions. Whatever your faith is, your beliefs, it doesn't really matter, because what matters is that these people are carrying on traditions that terrorists, these extremists that we're told are here to liberate Syria, they're carrying on traditions that these terrorists wanted to eliminate, and they weren't successful. So things like that give me hope.
So what is your long-term goal, and are you planning to, where do you plan to live? Where do you plan to do over the next 5, 10 years to continue to move your message along and, help the Syrian people?
That is a good question. I'll let you know when I know. No, I don't have a long-term goal. I've rather been a drifter in the sense that I go where I feel I need to go. So I don't really have a long-term goal at this point. I will continue to advocate not only for Syria, but anywhere where I feel I can contribute to at least shining a little bit of truth on a very distorted issue, whether it's in the Middle East or elsewhere.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for what you do, and thank you for coming on Crush the Street. If people want to learn more about you and your work and where they can find information that you're putting out, please let them know where they can go and what they can expect to find.
On my blog, I tend to republish mainly articles I've published on Mid-Press News or 21st Century Wire or Russia Today. So my blog is mainly that content, although I would encourage people to scroll back to the years 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, when I did live in Gaza, because much of what I was writing then is still happening today. The targeting of innocent, unarmed Palestinian civilians in border regions or elsewhere is still happening on a daily basis today. So you can at least get a sense from my blog what that's like from a first-hand perspective. Otherwise, I'm more active on Twitter these days. Facebook is censoring me pretty heavily. I still post there, but I noticed that it doesn't get the same kind of reception as it used to. So I also post on Gab, but I mean, my main platforms are Twitter, my blog, and Patreon.
Eva, I want to thank you so much for coming on Crush the Street. You're welcome back anytime. Yeah, we'll be sure to let you know when this is up and running and on the internet.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on.